She was given to a drunken duke as punishment, a man who remembered nothing but who ended up loving her unconditionally. Have you ever seen an entire life change because of a single agreement made at a bar table? Well, that's exactly what happened in the ancient city of Valle de los Santos, where dust mixed with secrets and each family hid more pain than it could bear. One hot afternoon, a young woman named Elena was handed over as if she were a debt to Fernando de Alcantara, a strong duke marked by loneliness and the weight of responsibilities he had inherited too soon. That night, no one imagined that two broken souls were about to meet and that this encounter would not only change their destiny, but also reveal something that had been kept secret for years and was hidden in a forgotten safe. At the end of the story, this will leave you completely shocked. While the city judged them, Fernando tried to understand why someone had handed over an adult woman as punishment, and Elena tried to understand why life seemed determined to tear her away from her own dreams. But what neither of them knew was that this mansion, which seemed like the end of everything, would actually be the beginning, the place where pain and hope would walk together. Today I'm going to tell you how that unlikely encounter changed everything. Now tell me, from which city are you watching this story? The sun was beginning to set over the Valley of the Saints, spilling orange tones over the ancient buildings. The cicadas sang loudly, as if trying to drown out the tension that hung in the air. The dust kicked up by a horse's hooves announced the arrival of someone at the imposing mansion in the valley, and it was no ordinary visitor. Before continuing with today's story, I want to say something. I welcome everyone to the Love and Romance of the Past channel. Musamin, you make me very happy with your presence. With your choice to listen to this story, accompany me, and walk with me through each chapter. I am truly grateful for all the love, every comment, and this very special company. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening to this as a story. I love to imagine you on the other side, in some corner of the world, listening to this story calmly and feeling every emotion with me. Rodrigo Mendoza was riding on the horse's back, and behind him, holding tightly to her brother's waist, was Elena. Her face showed a sad beauty, marked by nights of silent crying. She wore a simple dress of light fabric, already covered in dust from the journey, and her eyes avoided looking ahead, as if she did not want to see her own destiny approaching. Rodrigo pulled hard on the reins, causing the horse to stop in front of the iron gates of the mansion. The gate was iron, revealing well-tended gardens and a majestic stone building that inspired both respect and fear. Rodrigo jumped down and pulled Elena's arm brutally. "Get down," he ordered in a harsh voice. Elena descended slowly, her legs trembling slightly, not out of fear of the Duke, but out of fear of what life still had in store for her. The smell of damp earth and old roses filled the air, mingling with the distant song of birds. Heavy footsteps could be heard from inside the mansion, and then the front door opened with a low creak. Fernando de Alcantara, Duke of Valle de los Santos, emerged. He was about 30 years old, with broad shoulders and an aristocratic bearing that, even when unsteady, conveyed authority. His hair was dark and unkempt, and his beard was unshaven. His eyes were deep and betrayed a weariness that went beyond the body. It was a weariness of the soul. At that moment, he gave off an unmistakable smell of wine. He held a bottle by the neck, and his steps were slightly uncoordinated. Known for his strength and a certain coldness since the premature death of his wife, Fernando was a man who faced everything alone, but who drowned himself in alcohol to forget his loneliness. Rodrigo stepped forward with a fake smile and said loudly, "Duke Fernando, here is what I promised you last night. My part of the deal is done." Fernando stopped on the steps at the entrance, frowning as he tried to remember the previous night. His memories were confused, blurred by alcohol, but he was sure of one thing. He had not agreed to receive anyone. "Agreement?" he asked in a hoarse, deep voice. "I drank with you last night, Rodrigo. I don't remember agreeing to anything more than that." Rodrigo laughed cynically. "Come on, Duke. A man of your position knows very well how these things work. My family's honor needed to be restored, and you generously agreed to marry my sister." Elena felt as if she were being stabbed with every word. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. Fernando descended a few more steps, approaching her, and for the first time looked her directly in the eyes. In her eyes he saw not only sadness, but also a silent strength and a wounded dignity that was still alive. "This is not right," Fernando said in a firm voice despite his drunkenness. "She is an adult woman, not merchandise, not an object of exchange." "Do as you please, Duke," Rodrigo shouted as he mounted his horse again. "She is now your responsibility," he said, and without giving them a chance to argue further, he spurred his horse and galloped away. The dust kicked up by the hooves rose like a thick cloud, and when it cleared, Elena found herself alone in front of the man her brother had entrusted with the task of marrying her. Fernando dropped the bottle on the porch table with a thud and ran his hand over his face, completely lost. "I don't know what they've done to you," he began sincerely, his voice thick with alcohol. "But please forgive my manners. I'm drunk. I'm not in any condition to do anything." Elena nodded silently, not knowing what to say. At that moment, the mansion door opened again, and a middle-aged woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, an immaculate apron, and a sharp gaze emerged from inside. It was Katerina, the mansion's housekeeper for over 15 years. "Duke Fernando, can I help you with anything?" Katerina asked politely, already sensing her employer's state. Fernando let out a bitter laugh and shook his head. "Can you believe, Katerina, that a man left this woman here saying he had promised to marry her last night? And I don't remember anything. Absolutely nothing." He ran his hands through his tousled hair, clearly confused and frustrated. "I'm going to sleep. I need to sleep." Katerina looked at Elena with compassion, immediately understanding the delicate situation, and then turned to the Duke. "Go rest, Duke Fernando. I'll take care of things here." Fernando staggered up the steps, leaning on the wooden railing, and disappeared inside. Katerina approached Elena kindly. "What is your name, dear?" "Elena," the young woman replied in a low voice. "Elena Mendoza." Katerina studied her face for a moment and saw a frightened but dignified young woman. "Come, I'll take you to the guest room. You must be tired from your journey." As they walked through the elegant corridors of the mansion, Katerina couldn't help but ask, "Who are you, Elena? What happened?" Elena took a deep breath and the tears finally escaped. "My brother was furious with me. He wanted to leave town and start a new life, but he didn't want to take me with him. A man had promised to marry me, but he backed out at the last minute, which embarrassed my family." Her voice trembled. "Last night my brother drank with the Duke, and the Duke agreed to marry me. At least that's what my brother said." Katerina put her hand to her mouth, shocked. "My God, and the Duke doesn't remember anything?" "No," Elena replied, wiping her tears and shaking her head. Katerina stopped in front of a carved wooden door and opened it slowly, revealing a luxurious and comfortable room with a four-poster bed and a window overlooking the gardens. "Rest today, my child. I'll go and get you something to eat. Tomorrow, when the Duke wakes up sober, we'll see what he has to say about all this." Elena entered the room, feeling the weight of everything that had happened that day fall on her shoulders. Katerina touched her arm gently before leaving and closing the door carefully. After eating, Elena sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room. She looked at her calloused hands, the hands of someone who washed other people's clothes, who cooked and cleaned. She worked tirelessly so that no one would call her useless, hands that had never held anything that was truly hers. And now, in that luxurious room, surrounded by furniture worth more than everything she had ever owned in her life, Elena felt more lost than ever. "How did I get here?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Her mother had died in childbirth, bleeding to death so that she could be born. And since that day, Elena had carried a guilt that no one had ever spoken aloud, but which was present in the looks and silences. Her father, Alfonso Mendoza, a fabric merchant, never openly blamed her for her mother's death, but he could not look at her without seeing the woman he had lost. Elena grew up in a silent house with her father and her brother Rodrigo, 10 years her senior. From an early age, she learned that her opinion did not matter, that her desires carried no weight, and that her only value lay in marrying well one day and not bringing dishonor to the family. She accepted this reality as she accepted the air she breathed, because there was no other option. When Elena was 20, yellow fever swept through the Valley of the Saints and took dozens of lives, including that of her father. He died in 3 days, delirious and calling out the name of his deceased wife, without even saying goodbye to his daughter. Rodrigo officially became her legal guardian, the owner of her life and her destiny when she was 30. And then the real nightmare began. Rodrigo had always been an ambitious and weak man, two dangerous characteristics when combined. He wanted more than the Valley of the Saints could offer him. He dreamed of the big city, of lucrative businesses, of a life of luxury and prestige. But there was a problem. Elena. Rodrigo couldn't just abandon her. Society wouldn't allow it. His reputation would be ruined. An unmarried sister was her brother's responsibility until she married or died. Then Miguel Salazar appeared, a 60-year-old widowed merchant who showed interest in marrying Elena. Rodrigo saw the perfect opportunity and practically sold his sister to the man without even asking her how she felt. Elena tried to refuse and begged her brother not to force her, but he was adamant. "You should be grateful that someone wants you," Rodrigo said contemptuously. "You are a woman without a dowry, without extraordinary beauty, without anything special. Miguel is being generous." Her brother's words hurt more than any blow. Elena accepted the engagement with her head bowed, resigned to the fate imposed on her. For weeks she prepared for a wedding she did not want, sewing her own wedding dress while tears ran down her face. However, 3 days before the ceremony, Miguel Salazar appeared at the Mendoza home and broke off the engagement without giving any clear explanation. Rodrigo was furious, not because of his sister's pain, but because of the public humiliation that this episode had caused. He blamed her for everything, saying she had ruined his reputation and his plans. For weeks, Elena lived locked up at home, unable to leave, treated as a disgrace to the family. It was then that he devised a plan. Rodrigo knew the reputation of Duke Fernando de Alcántara. He was a widowed and reclusive aristocrat who drowned his sorrows in endless bottles. Fernando frequented the same bar as Rodrigo, always alone in a dark corner, drinking until he passed out. Rodrigo watched the scene for days, studying the pattern and waiting for the perfect moment. He knew that in a society like theirs, a man's word, especially that of a duke, carried absolute weight. If he could get Fernando to accept Elena, even if he was drunk, there would be no turning back. Aristocratic honor would not allow a duke to retract a public promise. That night at the bar, Rodrigo placed two acquaintances of his at nearby tables, men of ill repute, but who would serve as witnesses. At the right moment, Rodrigo raised his voice. "Then it is agreed, Duke Fernando. Do you accept my sister Elena in marriage?" And he pushed more wine toward the Duke. Fernando, completely out of his mind, nodded his head, or perhaps just let it fall. Rodrigo didn't care. "Are you hearing this?" Rodrigo shouted to the other men in the bar. "Duke Fernando de Alcántara has just agreed to marry my sister Elena Mendoza. We have witnesses." And the two cronies confirmed it loudly, laughing. Fernando collapsed on the table minutes later, and Rodrigo left the bar with a victorious smile. That same night, he spread the news throughout half the city. "The Duke has agreed to marry my sister," he told anyone who would listen. "We had a conversation between men. There are witnesses. The agreement is made." By morning, the whole Valley of the Key was talking about it. Santos commented on the matter, and Rodrigo knew it was a done deal. Fernando could never go back on his word without completely destroying his honor and reputation. A duke did not go back on his word once it had been given publicly, even if that word had been wrested from him in a state of total drunkenness. It was the perfect trap, and Elena was the unwitting bait. When Rodrigo told Elena the next morning, she was in shock. "What have you done?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I solved your problem and mine," he replied coldly. "You're going to marry the Duke. The whole town already knows it, and I can finally leave this town without having to carry you along with me." Elena tried to protest, beg, and cry, but Rodrigo was adamant. "You should be grateful," he said contemptuously. "A woman like you, with no dowry, no mother, nothing, getting a duke is more than you deserve." And so, with no choice and no voice, Elena was packed up and taken to the mansion in the valley that same afternoon, before Fernando had time to wake up and understand what had happened. "I have no place in the world," Elena whispered to the empty room in a choked voice. "I never did." And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to truly cry. She cried for all she had lost, for all she had never had, and for all the dreams she had never been able to have. She cried for the little girl who wanted to be loved and found only indifference. She cried for the young woman who had been silenced and had her voice taken away from her all her life. She cried for the woman who, once again, was in the hands of a man who had not chosen her and who probably did not love her. "Mother," she whispered, staring at the ceiling, "if you are somewhere, help me because I can't take it anymore." Morning came to the mansion in the valley, bringing with it the shrill song of birds and the cruel light of the sun, which invaded the master bedroom without asking permission. Fernando de Alcántara woke up with the usual feeling. His head throbbed as if horses were galloping inside his skull. His mouth was dry as sand and his stomach churned, ready to expel what little was left inside. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the excessive brightness. The curtains were open, and he knew it was Katerina who had drawn them on purpose, in a silent attempt to make him wake up earlier and drink less, but it never worked. Fernando turned over in bed and saw that he was dressed in the clothes he had worn the day before, his dirty boots staining the fine embroidered linen sheets. He ran his hands over his bearded face, feeling the greasy skin and sour smell of someone who had drunk too much. Another night wasted, another hungover morning. The routine was so ingrained that he no longer felt shame, only a deep weariness of existence. "Another day," he muttered hoarsely. He forced himself to sit on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling slightly, as he automatically searched for the bottle he always left on the nightstand. That day, there was nothing there. Caterina must have taken it. Fernando de Alcántara, Duke of Valle de los Santos, lord of lands stretching for miles and owner of a fortune built up by generations of the Alcántara family, was completely and irretrievably lost. He looked around him, the luxurious bedroom, decorated with fine wood furniture and portraits of ancestors who watched him with silent disapproval. His family had always been very wealthy, powerful, and respected, but Fernando had barely known his father. The former duke died when he was only 2 years old, the victim of a fall from a horse during a hunt. Fernando had no memories of him, only stern portraits hanging on the walls of the mansion. The person who really raised him was Countess Mariana de Alcántara, his mother, a strong, elegant, and determined woman who took sole charge of managing the lands in his upbringing. She never remarried. She devoted herself entirely to educating the boy to become a man worthy of the title he had inherited so early. Fernando grew up under his mother's rigorous but loving tutelage. He learned about responsibility, duty, and honor. The Countess would repeat to him, "You are an Alcántara, Fernando. Our name means something. There are people who depend on you, on your decisions. Never forget that." And Fernando took those words to heart. When he turned 21, he was already managing the properties alongside his mother. He was already making important decisions. He was already respected. The Countess died when Fernando was 23, the victim of a sudden fever that took her in a matter of days. Fernando not only lost his mother, but also the only person who truly knew and guided him. Overnight, at the age of 23, he became completely responsible for everything. Land, employees, fortune, title. He did his best. He continued to run the business, kept the property running, and honored the Alcántara name. But a deep loneliness began to consume him. The huge mansion once filled with his mother's strong presence now seemed like a silent mausoleum. Fernando needed company and a purpose that went beyond work. So he turned his attention back to Alice Morales, the daughter of a neighboring aristocratic family. They had known each other since childhood. They played together when they were little, and as they grew up, they saw each other at parties and social events. Alice was beautiful, with wavy brown hair and honey-colored eyes. She was always smiling and very kind. She was a few years younger, but already of marriageable age. Fernando began to court her formally. He visited her family, brought her flowers. They talked for hours, and Alice seemed to reciprocate his feelings. She laughed at his jokes, touched his arm delicately, and looked at him affectionately. Fernando thought that perhaps he had finally found someone to share his life with. He proposed 6 months later, and Alice accepted with tears of joy. "I've always liked you, Fernando," she confessed. Since we were children, Fernando felt his heart warm. Perhaps this was true love and not just convenience. They were married in a beautiful ceremony attended by the entire Valley of the Saints. The first few months were happy, or so Fernando believed. Alice was an attentive wife. She took care of the house, talked to him at night, and smiled when he came home. Fernando allowed himself to believe that he had built a home, a family. But Alice had an ancient and irrational fear of deep water. She avoided the lake on the property. She had never learned to swim. It was summer and unbearably hot. Fernando suggested several times that they go to the lake to cool off. Alice always politely refused. You know I'm afraid, Fernando. But on a particularly hot day, Fernando insisted. We'll just dip our feet in, Alice. I'll be with you. I won't let anything happen. He didn't understand her fear. It seemed exaggerated to him. He believed that if she tried, she would see that it wasn't such a big deal. He insisted so much that Alice, wanting to please him, finally gave in. All right, she said with a nervous smile. But do you promise to stay close? She asked. I promise, Fernando assured her, and so they went to the lake that fateful afternoon. Alice entered the water with extreme caution, clinging tightly to Fernando's hand. She stayed in the shallow areas, with the water barely reaching her knees. Fernando, encouraged, went further into the water and called to her. Come on, Alice, it's wonderful. She shook her head, but he laughed, took her hand, and pulled her a little further in, just a little further. Trust me, he said. Alice was visibly tense, but she tried to trust her husband. Then her foot slipped on a mud-covered rock. She lost her balance and fell forward, submerging her head. Panic instantly overwhelmed her. She began to thrash around desperately, swallowing water and unable to find support. Fernando tried to hold her, but Alice was in a state of absolute panic and clung to him wildly, dragging them both down. Alice, calm down. I've got you, he shouted. But she couldn't hear him, couldn't understand him, just fought blindly against the water she had always feared. Fernando dove down and tried to lift her up, but Alice's soaked clothes and panic made it almost impossible. He managed to bring her to the surface for a few seconds, but she sank back down, swallowing more water. Fernando dove down again, struggling desperately. When he finally managed to get her to the shore, Alice was unconscious and her lips were purple. Fernando desperately tried to revive her. He pressed hard on her chest to expel the water, blew air into her lungs, and shouted her name until he was hoarse. Alice! Alice! Come back to me, please. But she didn't come back. Alice Morales de Alcantara, his childhood friend and beloved wife, drowned in the lake on the property while Fernando, helpless and devastated, watched her life slip away without being able to do anything. He held her wet body in his arms and cried out to the empty sky, blaming himself for insisting, for not respecting her fear, for not being fast enough or strong enough to save her. The funeral was devastating. Alice's family openly blamed him. You killed her, her mother snapped, hatred in her eyes. My daughter was afraid of water, and you forced her. She would be alive if she had married any man but you. Fernando couldn't respond because deep down he completely agreed. It was her fault, he insisted. He didn't respect her fear. He killed the woman he loved. After the funeral, he returned to the empty mansion and for the first time in his life, drank himself into unconsciousness and never stopped. Months turned into years. Fernando continued to take minimal care of the properties. He signed the necessary documents and made basic decisions, but he did everything mechanically, without soul or purpose. Life no longer had any meaning for him. He had killed Alice. That certainty gnawed at him day and night. The people of the Valley of the Saints, who had once admired and respected him as a young and responsible duke, now felt pity for him. Poor Duke Fernando, they whispered. He never recovered from his wife's death. Fernando went to live in the village bar where he drank alone in a dark corner and shooed away anyone who tried to approach him. Katerina, the housekeeper who had served his mother and now tried to take care of him, was the only one who still insisted, but even she was beginning to lose hope. Fernando knew he had to take charge of his responsibilities. He knew he had duties, but nothing made sense without Alice alive. Then the bedroom door opened. Katerina entered with a stern look on her face, carrying a tray with tea. Good morning, Duke Fernando, she said in a firm voice. Fernando grunted as he took the cup with trembling hands. Don't start, Katerina. Katerina crossed her arms. I didn't come to lecture you, sir. I came to warn you that there is an urgent matter. Your fiancé is at home, very frightened, waiting to speak with you. Fernando froze. Fiancé? What fiancé? Elena Mendoza, sir, Katerina replied, keeping her voice calm. Elena Mendoza, sir. Her brother brought her here. saying that you had agreed to marry her. Don't you remember? Fernando felt panic rising within him. No, I don't. Sir, it's a done deal, Katerina continued. I spoke to the employees and apparently the whole town already knows. There were witnesses at the bar. You'd better talk to her. She's very frightened. I'll run you a bath, get dressed, and come downstairs. Fernando looked at her in a daze but finally nodded, defeated. All right, I'll be right down. Fernando remained motionless for several long minutes. After Katerina left the room, he looked at himself in the foggy mirror, and the man staring back at him was a shadow of his former self. His hair was unkempt, his beard unshaven, his eyes red and sunken. What a disgrace, he muttered to himself. He forced himself to get up, each movement requiring superhuman effort. He walked to the bathroom next to the bedroom, where a porcelain bathtub filled with warm water was already waiting for him. Katerina was always one step ahead, always taking care of him, even when he didn't deserve it. Fernando took off his dirty clothes and submerged himself in the water, closing his eyes as he tried to organize his chaotic thoughts. Fragments of that night at the bar began to fit together with painful clarity. Rodrigo Mendoza, sitting across from him, with that fake smile. My sister is a good girl, Duke. Discreet, hardworking, no trouble. Fernando vaguely remembered nodding his head, too drunk to process what was being said. So it's agreed. Rodrigo's voice now echoed in his mind. Do you accept my sister Elena in marriage? And he, Fernando de Alcantara, completely drunk, had responded with something. Maybe a yes, maybe just a grunt that Rodrigo interpreted as acceptance. And the witnesses. Fernando now remembered the voices of the other men confirming. The Duke agreed, so be it. He whispered, so be it, as he sank deeper into the water, wishing he could disappear completely. But he couldn't. He was a Duke, and his word, even spoken in a state of utter drunkenness, carried weight. In a society where aristocratic honor was everything, going back on a public promise would mean completely destroying his reputation and that of the Alcantara family. The lands would continue to produce, the money would continue to come in, but the name would be ruined. And even worse, now there was a young woman involved. A young woman who, according to Catalina, was frightened and abandoned by her own brother. Fernando rubbed his face hard. He didn't want to get married. He didn't want to drag anyone else into his own ruin. He washed slowly, rubbing his body with soap until his skin was red, as if he could wash away the shame and guilt as well. He got out of the bathtub, dried himself with a thick towel, and returned to the bedroom. He opened the mahogany wardrobe and chose clean clothes, dark trousers, a white linen shirt, and a gray waistcoat. Getting dressed required concentration. His hands were still shaking from the hangover. He sat down in front of the mirror and picked up the razor. With careful movements, he began to shave, slowly revealing the face he had hidden for days. With each stroke of the blade, he saw more clearly the man he had become. He was too thin, pale, and gaunt, but at least now he looked like a duke, not a beggar. When he was finished, he combed his dark hair back and secured it with a small piece at the nape of his neck, as was customary among nobles. He looked at himself in the mirror once more. Better, not good, but better. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. You need to do this, he said to himself quietly. You created this situation. Now face it. He left the bedroom and walked through the long corridors of the mansion. His footsteps echoed in the silence. He descended the marble staircase, holding tightly to the handrail, and headed for the library. The library of the Valley Mansion was an imposing room, with oak bookshelves that ran from floor to ceiling and were filled with old books, a stone fireplace that was now unlit, and large windows through which the golden morning light streamed in. There, sitting in a leather armchair near the window, was Elena Mendoza. Fernando paused at the entrance for a moment, watching her. She was wearing a simple dress made of light-colored fabric, already somewhat wrinkled from the journey. Her brown hair was pulled back into a low bun, with a few stray strands escaping. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and she was staring at the floor, her posture stiff with terror, but trying to hide it. Fernando cleared his throat softly to announce his presence. Elena looked up abruptly, and their eyes met. She had dark brown eyes, deep, filled with a sadness that Fernando recognized immediately because he saw that same sadness as in his own reflection every day. Miss Mendoza, he said in a formal voice as he entered the library and closed the door behind him. Elena stood up immediately and gave him a quick, nervous curtsy. Duke Fernando, she replied in a low voice, almost a whisper. Fernando gestured for her to sit down again and pulled up a chair, sitting at a respectful distance. The silence between them was heavy, laden with everything they didn't know how to express. I need to apologize, Fernando began, running his hand through his freshly combed hair in a gesture of frustration. Yesterday afternoon, I was completely drunk. I don't remember clearly everything that was said. Elena kept her eyes downcast. My brother said you agreed to marry me. Her voice trembled slightly, but she continued. I didn't know anything about this until yesterday morning, when he told me. I didn't want to come, but he said there was no choice, that the whole town already knew, and it would be a disgrace for everyone if I didn't go. Fernando felt the weight of those words. She was also a victim, even more so than he was. Your brother, Fernando asked carefully. Where is he now? Elena finally looked up, and he saw tears forming in her eyes. He left. Eduardo went to another city. He had wanted to leave for a long time, but I was the weight that kept him here. Now that he's left me with you, he's free. Her voice broke on the last word. Fernando felt anger rising inside him, not against her, but against Rodrigo, the man who had used his own sister as a bargaining chip. He abandoned you, Fernando said. Not as a question, but as a bitter statement. Elena nodded, quickly wiping away the tear that had escaped her. Yes, sir. Fernando stood up abruptly, walked to the window, and tried to control his rage and frustration. This is unacceptable, he said. It's cruel, he turned to her. And I was the drunken idiot who allowed this to happen. Elena looked at him, and for the first time, her voice sounded firm, with a dignity that surprised Fernando. Sir, I understand that you don't want me here. I understand that this was a mistake, but I have nowhere else to go. My brother left, and everyone knows that I was brought here. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. If you don't want to marry me, I can work here. I can cook, wash, and clean. I can earn my keep, just don't send me away. The proposal took Fernando by surprise. He looked at the young woman who, despite being clearly terrified, still had enough strength to offer work in exchange for shelter. There was courage in her, a courage he wasn't sure he was capable of. Fernando ran his hands over his face, feeling the crushing weight of the situation. You don't need to work as a servant, he finally said in a tired voice. That wouldn't be appropriate. He sat back down and looked at her directly. The truth is that a duke's word cannot be changed, Miss Mendoza. Not in a society like ours. If I go back on my word now, it will be a public scandal. My reputation, which is already hanging by a thread, will be completely destroyed. Elena paled. So you're going to marry me out of obligation, out of fear of what people will say? Fernando let out a long, heavy sigh. It's not just fear of what people will say. It's the reality of who we are. I am a duke. You were publicly announced as my fiancé. There were witnesses. The whole town knows. If I back out now, I will not only tarnish my name, but yours as well. You will be the rejected woman, impossible to marry, dishonored forever. He paused. At least, as my wife, you will have protection, name, and position. Fernando looked at her and said in a low but firm voice, Now I remember, not everything, but enough. Your brother approached me, spoke of you, of marriage. I, in my deplorable state, said something that he interpreted as acceptance, and there were men there, listening and confirming. He looked at his own hands. So yes, Miss Mendoza, we are getting married, not because I want to or because you want to, but because there is no other way out that will not completely destroy us both. He looked up at her. And I have already destroyed too many people in my life. I'm not going to add you to that list, Fernando continued. The preparations will begin soon. The ceremony must be held soon before more rumors arise. Katerina will help you with everything you need. Elena nodded slowly, too weak to argue. Yes, sir. Fernando walked toward the door, but stopped before leaving. He turned to her one last time. I will not be a good husband, Miss Mendoza. I am a broken man, drowning in vice and tormented by the deaths I have caused. But I promise you that I will not be cruel. You will have respect, you will have a home, You will have protection. That is the least I can offer." Elena looked at him and her voice was firm. "And I will not be a burden, Duke Fernando. I will do everything I can not to get in the way of your life." Her words hit Fernando like a punch. He recognized in them the same wound he carried, feeling unwanted and guilty for the simple fact of existing. He left the library without saying another word, closing the door gently behind him. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall, closed his eyes, and tried to control his breathing. "What did I do?" he whispered to himself. "My God, what have I done?" On the other side of the door, Elena remained seated in the armchair, staring at her own hands. She was officially trapped in a marriage that neither of them wanted, with a man who didn't know her and who, evidently, also had his own demons. But at least she had a roof over her head. At least she had a name that would protect her. It was more than she had yesterday, and maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to survive for now. The day of the wedding dawned cloudy, as if the sky itself understood that this was not a celebration. The ceremony would be held in the small chapel on the property, an old stone building covered in ivy where generations of the Alcantara family had been married and baptized. There would be no guests, only Katerina and two employees of the mansion as witnesses. Elena dressed herself, looking in the mirror and barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The dress fit her perfectly, but her eyes were empty. "Today I become a duchess," she whispered, "and I've never felt so lost." Katerina knocked on the door, entered, and brought in a simple bouquet of white flowers from the garden. "It's time, dear," said the housekeeper with genuine kindness. Elena nodded, took the bouquet with trembling hands, and followed Katerina through the hallways to the mansion's exit. They walked through the garden to the chapel, whose wooden door was ajar. Elena entered, and the first thing she saw was Fernando standing in front of the makeshift altar. He was wearing a dark formal suit. He was clean-shaven and well-groomed, but his gaze was distant, as if he were somewhere else. When Elena walked down the short aisle toward him, Fernando glanced at her briefly, and she saw in his eyes neither desire nor love, but resignation. It was like watching two condemned men walking together to the gallows. The priest, an elderly man named Father Miguel, who had known Fernando since childhood, officiated the ceremony in a solemn but quick voice, as if he wanted to shorten the suffering, and said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." There was a pause. "You may kiss the bride." Fernando looked at Elena, and she saw the discomfort on his face. She approached him, leaned down, and gave him a quick, chaste kiss on the forehead. They returned to the mansion in absolute silence. Fernando walked several steps ahead and Elena behind, holding her dress so she wouldn't trip. At the entrance to the mansion, Fernando finally stopped and turned to her. Elena called him by his name for the first time, without the formal address. "I need to make something clear," she said, looking at him. "I need to make something clear. This marriage is only in name to protect us socially, but I do not intend to consummate it." Elena's cheeks flushed, reddened with embarrassment, and perhaps also with something else, relief mixed with humiliation. "It's not about you," Fernando said quickly. "It's about me. I have nothing to offer anyone. You are free on this property, Elena. You can go wherever you want and do whatever you want." "I understand," Elena replied. Fernando nodded and disappeared down the hallway. Elena stood there, still dressed as a bride, feeling lonelier than ever. It was official. She was the Duchess Valle de los Santos, and she would never truly be anyone's wife. Later, when Elena changed out of her wedding dress and into simple everyday clothes, she went to the kitchen, where she found Katerina making tea. "May I sit down?" she asked timidly. Katerina smiled warmly. "Of course, dear. This is your home now." Elena sat down at the rustic kitchen table, so different from the formal rooms of the mansion. "Katerina, may I ask you a question?" The housekeeper nodded as she poured the tea. "Was Duke Fernando always like this?" Katerina sighed deeply and sat down opposite Elena. "No, child, he was different. He was a good man, responsible and cheerful. Sometimes he stirred his tea distractedly, but his wife's death devastated him." Elena leaned forward, curious. Katerina told her how it had all happened, how Ali had drowned while Fernando desperately tried to save her. He never forgave himself. He was never the same after that. Elena felt her chest tighten. "So he blames himself. Every day," Katerina confirmed. "He believes he killed his own wife, and since then, He has been drowning his pain in alcohol. She looked directly at Elena and took her hands. He's a good man, Elena, and I know what you're about to face won't be easy, but maybe you can help him. Elena didn't answer. She just squeezed Katerina's hands, not knowing if she had the strength to save someone when she was barely managing to save herself. Meanwhile, Fernando was locked in the library, sitting behind the large mahogany table covered with documents and accounting books. In front of him, Otavio Rodriguez, administrator of the Alcantara lands for more than 20 years, pointed out the necessary numbers and signatures. Otavio was a middle-aged man with gray hair and an always correct posture. He was married to Caterina, and the two of them had become the only true friends Fernando still had. Here, Duke Fernando, I need your signature to authorize the sale of last month's wheat harvest, Otavio said. Fernando signed mechanically without really reading. He was lucky that Otavio had always taken such good care of everything. Even when Fernando was completely lost in alcohol, Otavio kept the land productive, the employees paid, and the business running. Fernando only had to sign papers. Done, said Fernando. Otavio carefully gathered the documents and then looked at the Duke with a smile. Congratulations on your marriage, Duke Fernando. Miss Elena seems like a kind-hearted young woman. Fernando let out a bitter, humorless laugh. Thank you for dragging an innocent girl into my misfortune. I don't know if that deserves congratulations, Otavio. Otavio chose his words carefully. Sir, Katerina and I always support you, you know that. And maybe, just maybe, that young woman is exactly what you need. Fernando shook his head wearily. I don't need anything other than to be left alone. Otavio took a deep breath. With all due respect, sir, what you need is a reason to stop drinking. The silence that followed was heavy. Fernando looked at the administrator and, for a moment, it seemed as if he was going to explode with rage. But he didn't. He simply looked away. Thank you for the documents, Otavio. You may leave. Octavio nodded, knowing he had overstepped the mark, but without regret. He left and closed the door gently. Fernando was left alone in the library. The silence was deafening. He looked around and his eyes fell on the bottle of cognac on the wooden sideboard in the corner of the room. It was there, waiting as always. Fernando slowly got up and walked toward it. He took it in both hands, feeling the weight of the glass and the amber liquid swaying inside. Octavio was right. Katerina was right. Elena deserved better than this. He squeezed the bottle tightly, closing his eyes. No, 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 not today. I can do this. I can do it. But his hands were shaking. He put the bottle back on the sideboard and walked away, breathing heavily. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark garden. He stood there for minutes that felt like hours, struggling. Alice's voice echoed in his mind. Fernando, help me. Her cry as she sank the utter despair. He shook his head violently, trying to push the memories away, but they never left. He turned abruptly, went back to the sideboard, picked up the bottle and opened it in one swift movement. I'm sorry, he whispered, not knowing to whom, and drank directly from the neck of the bottle, feeling the liquid burn his throat and produce the familiar and desired numbness. He drank until he could no longer think, until the world became blurry. Then he staggered out of the library. Fernando wandered aimlessly through the dark corridors of the mansion, tripping over his own boots. He ended up in the garden, the cold night air hitting his face, hot from the alcohol. He sat down on a stone bench with the almost empty bottle still in his hand. He tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't respond. He staggered. The bottle slipped from his hand and shattered on the stone floor. He took one more step, tripped over his own feet, and fell heavily on his side. His forehead hit the edge of a stone on the path. He felt a sharp pain and noticed something warm running down his forehead. He lay there, unable to get up, staring at the sky spinning above him until he slowly lost consciousness. In the mansion, Elena was in her room trying to sleep, but she couldn't. She tossed and turned in bed, thinking about the absurd day she had experienced. She had married a stranger. Now she was a duchess, but she wasn't a real wife. She wasn't anything real. She got up in frustration and decided to take a walk. She quietly descended the stairs, wandered through the hallways, kept walking, and ended up in the garden, drawn by the night breeze. That's when she saw him. Fernando was lying motionless on the stone floor, a dark stain spreading from his forehead. Elena, sir, ran and knelt beside him, her heart racing, and touched his shoulder. Wake up, please. He groaned, half conscious, his eyes half open. There was blood on his forehead, an ugly cut. He must have fallen and hit his head. You have to get out of here, Elena said, trying to lift him up. Fernando was bigger and heavier, but the alcohol had left him so weak that, with enormous effort, she managed to get him to lean on her. She practically dragged him back inside the mansion. They climbed the stairs with difficulty, stumbling several times. Fernando muttered incomprehensible things, but at least he was walking, albeit unsteadily. Elena didn't know where his room was, but she ended up finding the double doors to the master bedroom. She pushed them with the elbow over her shoulder and they went in. It was a huge room, dominated by an imposing bed. She guided him there and laid him down carefully. Fernando fell backward onto the bed, breathing heavily. Elena ran to the adjoining bathroom, grabbed some water and clean cloths, returned, and began to carefully clean the blood from his face. The cut was deep, but it didn't seem serious enough to require a doctor. She cleaned it delicately, removing the dried blood. Fernando was semi-conscious, his eyes half open, staring at her without really focusing. When she placed the damp cloth directly on the wound to stop the bleeding, he shuddered but did not complain. Elena worked silently and with concentration. She took a clean cloth and improvised a bandage, tying it around his head to keep pressure on the wound. Her hands were shaking, but she managed it. When she finished, she was about to step away when suddenly Fernando grabbed her wrist with weak fingers. Elena froze, her heart racing. He looked at her, his eyes glassy, but there was something there. Something that pierced through the fog of alcohol. You, he said, his voice slurred and the words difficult to form. You are my wife, did you know that? Elena felt her eyes burn. Yes, sir, I know. He continued to look at her with that strange intensity, drunk but real. You are very beautiful, Elena. The words came out in a drunken whisper. She didn't know if he was serious or if it was just the alcohol, but something inside her broke a little. Go to sleep, Duke, she said softly, pulling away from his grip. She pulled the blankets up and covered herself. Fernando was already falling asleep, his head turned to one side and breathing deeply. Elena stood there watching him. Without the tension and mask of sleep, he looked different, younger and more vulnerable. She hesitantly reached out and gently touched the side of his face. Finally, Elena left the bedroom and closed the door carefully. The days following the wedding turned into weeks and then months. Elena began to get to know the property better, its nooks and crannies and its secrets. Katerina became her guide, friend, and confidant. One sunny morning, the housekeeper took her to the Valley of the Saints to buy new clothes, dresses worthy of a duchess. The shop assistants bowed exaggeratedly when she entered. Duchess Elena, what an honor to welcome you. But in the corners, Elena heard the whispers. She's the one who married the drunken duke. Poor girl, so young and already a widow with a living husband. Elena pretended not to hear. She held her head high, as Catalina had taught her. Ignore them, dear. Tongues only hurt when we give them power. Elena also grew fond of Ottavio. The administrator was a gentle man, slow to speak and with infinite patience. She began to ask about the estate, interested in the crops, the contracts, the numbers. At first, Ottavio was surprised, but he soon realized that she was very intelligent, quick to grasp concepts and ask pertinent questions. You have a sharp mind, Duchess, he said one day with genuine admiration. Few aristocrats were interested in practical details. Elena smiled shyly. I always wanted to learn, but I was never allowed to. Ottavio began to include her in conversations about management, and she absorbed everything like a dry sponge absorbs water. For the first time in her life, Elena felt that her intelligence had value. One day a letter arrived. Elena recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Rodrigo. She opened it with trembling hands and began to read. It was only a few lines in which he asked her for money, claiming that he was having difficulties in the big city and that, as his sister, she had an obligation to help him. There was no mention of how she was doing, nor a hint of regret for having abandoned her. Elena stared at the letter for a few seconds, feeling a mixture of anger and pain. Then calmly she walked over to the fireplace in the living room, threw the letter into the fire, and watched as the words turned to ashes. She did not reply. She owed Rodrigo nothing. Elena hardly ever saw the Duke. When she did see him, it was always the same. He would stagger home in the early hours of the morning, struggle up the stairs, and lock himself in his room. Sometimes she would wake up to the sound of glass breaking and furniture falling. But she never went there. She respected the distance he had imposed. Elena understood that this was his life. Now she had an invisible husband, a ghost who lived in the same house but inhabited another world. Painful, yes, but she had learned to live with greater pains. 5 months passed in that strange routine, but Elena was changing. She gained the trust of the employees who greeted her with genuine respect. Katerina constantly reminded her that she must take her role as Duchess seriously. You are the lady of this house, Elena. Behave as such. And Elena began to understand that this was her role, her function. The Duke never objected when she began to give orders and make decisions. He didn't even notice. So Elena went further. She had the heavy, dark curtains in the living rooms replaced with lighter fabrics that let in the light. She began to place fresh flowers in every room. She also instructed the gardeners on how to care for the garden, which had been neglected. She asked them to plant more roses, daisies, and lavender. The mansion began to breathe again, and that girl who had arrived frightened, withdrawn, and invisible was transformed into a strong and respected woman. The lady of that house, she walked through the hallways with her head held high, not out of arrogance, but out of the dignity she had earned. The employees came to her to solve problems. Ottavio consulted her on decisions. Katerina smiled with pride. Elena was becoming something she never imagined she would be. Someone with power, with a voice, and with a purpose, and despite everything, that made her feel alive. Fernando, lost in his own alcoholic haze, didn't notice it right away, but little by little, even drunk, he began to notice the changes. The curtains were different, there were flowers, the food was better, and things were running more smoothly. In the days that followed, Fernando began to pay more attention. He saw her talking to the employees, giving instructions and smiling. She was good at that. Summer had arrived with a vengeance in Valle de los Santos. The heat was intense, and the dry air burned her throat. One particularly stifling afternoon, Elena decided to go see the lake on the property. Katerina had mentioned it several times, but Elena had never had the courage to do so. Today, however, the heat overcame her excitement. She walked through the gardens and followed the path that led to the lake. When she arrived, she was impressed. It was larger than she had imagined, surrounded by leafy trees that provided shade and with clear water reflecting the blue sky. Elena sat on the shore, took off her boots, and dipped her feet in the cool water. She closed her eyes and felt immediate relief. The sound of the water, the birds, and the wind in the treetops was almost hypnotic. That's when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned around with a start and saw Fernando standing a few feet away watching her. He was sober. She noticed it immediately, his clear eyes, his less hunched posture. He was wearing a simple white shirt and dark pants. "Elena," he said in a firm but strange voice. "Duke," she replied, her heart racing for no apparent reason. He took a few steps forward but stopped away from the water. "You shouldn't stay there." His tone was not commanding, but genuinely concerned. Elena understood immediately. Alice. She had died there. "Sir," she said softly, "I can swim, and I'm just getting my feet wet." He looked at her again. The silence that followed was heavy. Elena slowly took her feet out of the water, stood up, and dried her feet on the grass. She walked over to where Fernando was and sat down on a smooth rock. After hesitating, he sat down too, keeping a respectful distance. They remained silent for several minutes, listening only to the lake. It was Fernando who spoke first. "I need to apologize to you." Elena turned to look at him. "Why, for everything, Braham," he said, running his hands through his hair. "For agreeing to that deal when I was drunk, for ruining your life, for being an absent husband, for everything." Elena took a deep breath. "You didn't ruin my life, sir. My life was already ruined long before you came along." He looked at her in surprise. "But I tied you to a loveless marriage with no future. And you think I would have a future? If I went back to my brother's house, at least here I have a roof over my head, food, and respect." She replied, "It's more than I ever had." Fernando lowered his head. "You deserve more than that." "Maybe," Elena agreed, "but life rarely gives us what we deserve, does it?" She looked at the lake. You didn't deserve to lose Alice like that either. Fernando shuddered at the sound of the name. I killed her. No, Elena said firmly. It was an accident, a tragedy. It was an accident, a tragedy. I insisted she go into the water, Fernando said, his voice breaking. She was afraid, and I forced her. Elena moved a little closer. She didn't know that would happen. You can't punish her forever for something she couldn't have foreseen. But you should have saved her, he whispered. I tried, Elena. I tried so hard, but I couldn't. She died in my arms and I couldn't save her. Elena felt her chest tighten. Elena felt her chest tighten. Without thinking too much about it, she reached out and touched his hand. Fernando looked at their joined hands, surprised. You have people here who love you. Katerina, Otavio, the employees. They all want you to get better, to really live. He shook his head. I can't stop drinking. I try, Elena. Sometimes days go by without me touching a bottle, but then the guilt comes back. The memories come back, and I can't stand it. Then don't do it alone, she said, squeezing his hand. Let me help you. Let them help you. You don't have to carry this burden alone. Fernando stared at her. Why do you care? I'm nothing to you. Elena held his hand firmly, looking him in the eyes. Because underneath all that pain, I see a good man. I see someone who deserves a second chance. And because you hesitated, but you kept going. Because I'm alone too, and maybe we can be less alone together. The words hung in the air between them. Fernando looked at Elena as if he were seeing her for the first time. Not the woman who had been forced to marry him, but Elena, a person who also suffered and struggled, and yet still reached out. I don't know if I can, he whispered. I don't know how. Then learn, Elena said in a firm but kind voice. One day at a time, 1 hour at a time. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to try to make normal. And today we're going to have dinner together. Do you need something to eat? Fernando closed his eyes. Elena then let go of his hand. They sat there on the shore of the lake, where so much pain had occurred. But now perhaps something new could begin. When the sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, they returned to the mansion, walking together, closer than they had been in 5 months, but without holding hands. And when they entered, Catalina saw them through the window and smiled. Maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. That night, the dining room table was carefully set. Elena asked Katerina and Otavio to dine with them, breaking with the protocols that the mansion had followed for decades. When Fernando came downstairs and saw everyone sitting there, something inside him stirred. He sat down quietly. Conversation flowed around him, but Fernando was watching Elena, really watching her, perhaps for the first time since her arrival. The way her eyes sparkled when Otavio talked about the harvest, the discreet smile when Katerina told old stories, her upright and dignified posture, that of someone who has found her place. When Katerina and Otavio retired, Fernando remained seated, looking at Elena across the table. She began to get up, but he spoke. Stay, please. There was something in his voice that made Elena stop. They went to the living room. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Fernando poured tea for both of them. They sat close together. He remained silent for several long minutes. She, who couldn't take her eyes off him, began to feel uncomfortable under his intense gaze. What's wrong, sir? She asked quietly. Fernando slowly shook his head. From now on, call me Fernando. And I was realizing something. That I'm an idiot, he said with raw sincerity. About what, Fernando? Yes, Elena asked. That I'm an idiot, he said with raw sincerity. You've been here 5 months. 5 months, Elena, and I've barely looked at you properly. He leaned forward. Today, seeing you there at the table, talking and smiling, I realized that I know nothing about you. The question was loaded with genuine interest. Elena felt something tighten in her chest. Why do you want to know now? Then he said, because I spent 5 months drowning in self-pity while you were here alone, rebuilding a life from scratch. He held her gaze. And why do you deserve to be seen? Really? Elena fell silent, fighting the emotion that was rising within her burrow. Fernando suddenly stood up, startling Elena, but he only knelt in front of her, taking her hands with an intensity that made her gasp. Elena, listen to me. His voice sounded hoarse and charged with emotion. Tonight, watching you at dinner, Seeing how Katerina and Octavio respect you, seeing the strong woman you have become despite everything they did to you. I really saw you, Elena, and I realized that you're not the woman they condemned to live here. He moved closer, his face inches from hers. You are the woman who saved this house, who brought life where there was only death, who made me want to try again when I had already given up on everything. Elena's heart was beating so hard that she was sure he could hear it. I didn't save anything. Yes, you did, said Fernando with absolute conviction. You saved me without even realizing it. He raised one of her hands, held her gaze, and kissed her fingers reverently. Elena felt an electric shock run through her entire body. Thank you, he whispered against her skin. Thank you for this dinner, for including me, for not throwing away the key to the door when it would have been so easy to do so. He lowered his hand but didn't let go. I promise, Elena, here and now in front of you, I'm going to stop drinking. I'm going to fight this with everything I have. His voice broke. Because you deserve a real husband. And I want, my God, I want to be that man for you. Fernando. Elena could barely speak, but he continued. I know I've failed so many times that you have every right not to believe me, but I'm asking you on my knees, literally. And he remained kneeling in front of her. Help me, he said. I want a chance to prove that I can be more than this disaster. Elena looked at this broken, vulnerable man who wasn't asking for pity, but for a chance to be better, and something inside her gave in completely. Get up, she said softly. Fernando obeyed, but she didn't let go of his hands. I'll give you that chance, but you have to promise you'll really try. I promise, he said firmly. And when you fail, Elena continued, because you will fail, you won't hide. You'll tell me. You'll let me help you. Fernando nodded. I promise. Elena stood up and came face to face with him. They were almost the same height, and she could see every detail of his face, marked by suffering but still beautiful. Then let's try it together, she said. And Fernando, in an impulse that surprised Piscinos Tintas, pulled her into an embrace. It was not a sensual embrace, but a desperate one. He was a man clinging to the only lifeline he had left. Elena responded by wrapping her arms around him and noticed that he was trembling. They remained like that for a few minutes that seemed suspended in time. When they separated, Fernando gently held Elena's face in his hands. You are beautiful, he said as if seeing her for the first time. Not only on the outside, but also on the inside. Elena blushed, her heart racing. It's true, Fernando insisted, and I was blind not to see it before. He lowered his hands, giving her space. But now I see it, and I'm not going to stop. That night, something fundamental changed between them. It was no longer just an agreement of convenience, but a real connection, and they both knew it. The days that followed were transformative. Fernando woke up early. Katerina secretly removed the bottles so he wouldn't see them. He knew, but he didn't complain. He would meet with Otavio, and his mind would regain clarity. But most importantly, he had lunch and dinner with Elena every day, and they had real conversations. They laughed together. Fernando began to smile again, and each of his smiles made Elena's heart race. Katerina noticed. They're falling in love, she told Otavio. Thank God, they're falling in love. Elena noticed it too. She noticed that she looked forward to dinner, that her heart raced when Fernando entered the room, that she thought about him during the day, and that she was both terrified and amazed. 2 weeks passed. Fernando hadn't drunk again. He laughed more, talked more, lived more. It seemed like he had everything under control until the relapse came. Elena woke up in the middle of the night to noises coming from the library. Her heart immediately sank, fearing the worst. She ran down the stairs, pushed open the door, and found Fernando on the floor, leaning against the bookshelf, with an empty bottle next to him and another half-finished bottle in his hand. He was completely drunk. His eyes were glassy, and his clothes were disheveled. Elena felt like her world was falling apart. All the hopes of the last few weeks were shattered in a second. She walked toward him with trembling legs. Fernando tried to focus on her. Elena fell to her knees and said, I'm sorry. Her voice came out slurred, intoxicated. Elena said nothing. She took the bottle from his hand and threw it away, causing the glass to shatter against the wall. The noise echoed in the silent library. Then with effort, she helped him up and dragged him to the sofa. She sat him there, and then everything she had been holding back exploded. Tears flowed hot, abundant, and uncontrollable. Elena cried. She cried for the deep disappointment, for the shattered hope, and for the pain of seeing the man she had fallen in love with destroy himself again. She cried because she had believed that this marriage could become a reality. Fernando, even in the fog of alcohol, saw the tears and something inside him broke. "No, don't cry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please don't cry." He reached out his trembling hand and with a gentleness that contrasted with his state, wiped the tears from her face. His fingers trembled against her skin. "I'm so sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry." But when he managed to focus his eyes, Fernando saw something that hurt him more than anything else. Pure disappointment, not anger or hatred, disappointment. Elena had believed in him, had bet on him, and he had failed her. That sight pierced him like a knife, even through his intoxication. Elena wiped her own tears with the back of her hand and took a deep breath to control herself. She got up from the sofa and walked away from him. When she spoke, her voice trembled, but she was firm. "Fernando, I was starting to really believe in you, in us, in a future together." Her voice broke, but she continued, "But I'm not going to stay here and watch you die little by little. I can't." She looked at him with pain in her eyes. "If you keep this up, I'll leave, I swear." The words fell like stones in the heavy silence of the library. Fernando tried to get up, but he staggered and fell back onto the sofa. "Lena, no, please, I need you." But she was already leaving, closing the door behind her. Fernando was left alone in the library, surrounded by empty bottles and the echo of her words. "If you keep this up, I'll leave." And for the first time in years, alcohol brought him no relief. Only the absolute terror of losing the only person who still believed in him, the only one he had begun to love. Elena went up to her room, locked the door, and collapsed onto the bed. She cried until she had no tears left, and when sleep finally came, it was heavy and full of bad dreams. Downstairs, Fernando spent the whole night on the sofa, sober enough to be aware of what he had done, and the magnitude of that realization was greater than any guilt he had ever felt. The next day, Fernando woke up on the sofa in the library with a sore body and a throbbing head. But this time it wasn't just a physical hangover, but the crushing weight of what he had done the night before. He got up with difficulty, looked around, and saw the empty bottle. He ran his hand over his face, feeling the shame burning inside him. Then Elena whispered into the void. Elena's words echoed endlessly in his head. "If you keep this up, I'll leave." He needed to fix this, but first he needed to fix himself. He walked to the dining room where he usually had breakfast with Elena. The table was set, but she was not there. Only Katerina was there, looking at him with a mixture of disappointment and concern. "Good morning, Duke Fernando," she said in a formal voice, colder than usual. Fernando sat down but did not touch his food. "She's not coming down, is she?" he asked hoarsely. Katerina shook her head. The Duchess had asked for breakfast to be brought to her room. She said she wasn't feeling well. Fernando closed his eyes, feeling the pain of those words. "Katerina, I need to talk to you. Come with me, please." They returned to the library. Fernando opened the door and Katerina stopped at the entrance, shocked by the number of full bottles on the library table. There were dozens of them, some hidden behind books, inside drawers, in every corner. Fernando took a deep breath and looking her straight in the eye said, "I know you were throwing the bottles out of the house, but I always had many stored away, hidden, like a coward who knew he was going to fail." He pointed to the bottles. "But last night I disappointed Elena, and she doesn't deserve that. She doesn't deserve a husband who hides behind bottles." Katerina remained silent, listening. Fernando continued in a firm voice despite his emotion. "So, please, these are all the bottles I have in the house. I want you to throw them all away one by one. I don't want a single bottle in this house." Katerina's eyes filled with tears. A small but genuine smile appeared on her face. "Sir," she began, her voice choked with emotion, "give us both a chance. Really, Mrs. Elena and you deserve it." Fernando nodded, unable to speak. Then Katerina called the servants. "Come here quickly." Two young men appeared at the door. She pointed to the bottles. "I want you to take all these bottles away and throw them away. All of them. If necessary, break them. I don't want to see a single drop of alcohol in this house." The boys immediately set to work, collecting the bottles into boxes. Fernando watched silently as they removed his crutch, his refuge, his poison. When the last bottle went out the door, he felt something strange. Not relief, but fear. Fear of facing life sober, but also determination. He would do it for Elena, for himself. Elena did not show up for lunch. Fernando ate alone, and every bite weighed on him like lead. He looked at the chair where she used to sit and felt his heart tighten. Katerina served the food in silence. "Is she okay?" Fernando asked quietly. "She's in her room, sir," Katerina replied. "She has asked not to be disturbed." Fernando nodded, respecting her space. He knew he needed to prove with actions, not words, that he had really changed, and that would take time. Elena didn't show up for dinner either. Fernando ate alone again. The silence in the mansion was deafening. After dinner, Fernando went to his office. For the first time in years, he sat down at his desk with a completely clear mind and called Otavio. The administrator entered cautiously. "Mr. Fernando," Otavio said, pointing to the chair in front of him. "Sit down, Otavio. I need to talk to you." Otavio sat down. Fernando took a deep breath. "I want you to know that, starting today, I will be back in charge of everything. The business, the land, the decisions. You have carried that burden alone for too long." Otavio began to protest, but Fernando raised his hand. "No, listen to me. Now you can rest. You can relax. I'm going to take on my responsibilities." Otavio smiled. "Sir, I always knew that the man the Countess raised was still in there." Fernando smiled sadly. "It was buried deep, but someone helped me dig it up." The days passed. Fernando kept his word. He spoke again with the merchants of the city. He visited the farm workers. He listened to employees who came to him with problems and requests. He attended meetings, reviewed contracts, and made decisions. His mind, finally free from the constant fog of alcohol, functioned with clarity and intelligence. Otavio watched the transformation in awe. "He's back," he said to Katerina. "Our Duke is back." But despite all the activity, there was a void. Elena continued to keep her distance. Fernando saw her from time to time, always from afar. She spent her afternoons in the garden, tending to the flowers and reading in the shade of the trees. He watched her from the office window with a heavy heart. He respected her time. He knew he had to prove to her and also to himself that he had really changed. The nights were the hardest, not because of the lack of alcohol, surprisingly, but because of the lack of her, because of the absence of conversations by the fireplace, because of the emptiness of the dining room table. Fernando realized something that both frightened and amazed him. He didn't miss drinking, he missed Elena. One night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, Fernando admitted to himself the truth he had been avoiding. He was completely and irrevocably in love with Elena, with her strength, her kindness, the way she had transformed that dead house into a home, and the way she had seen him when he was nothing but a mess. Love grew in his chest like something alive and pulsating, impossible to ignore, and he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to tell her. He needed her to know 2 months had passed since his relapse. One sunny afternoon, Fernando saw Elena again in the garden. She was sitting on the stone bench next to the rose bushes he had planted, with an open book on her lap, but her gaze lost in the horizon. The wind gently ruffled her hair. Fernando watched her for a moment, gathering his courage. Then he decided, "I won't wait any longer." He went downstairs, crossed the house, and went out into the garden. His footsteps on the grass made Elena turn around. Seeing him approach, her body tensed. Fernando stopped a few feet away, keeping a respectful distance. Elena spoke in a lower voice than she intended. She slowly closed the book. "Fernando?" He took a few more steps. Now he was closer. "I know you asked for space, and I respected that, but I need to talk to you. I need you to listen to me." Elena said nothing, but she didn't get up to leave either. Fernando took that as permission. "This time that has passed has been very difficult," he began. "Not because of the lack of alcohol, but because of your absence, because we don't have our conversations, because I don't see you every day." He took a deep breath, and then I realized something I should have understood a long time ago. He looked her straight in the eyes. "I love you, Elena." The silence that followed was absolute. Elena opened her eyes, the book about to slip from her hands. Fernando continued speaking, the words coming out urgently. I know I don't deserve it. I know I failed you in every way possible. But you need to know that I love you. Not out of gratitude or convenience. I love you because you are strong when I am weak. Because you brought light where there was only darkness. Because when I look at you, I see a future worth fighting for. I took another step. I haven't had a drink in 2 months. I'm not doing it to impress you, but because I finally understand, I don't need alcohol, I need you. Elena felt her eyes fill with tears. Fernando said with a trembling voice, I've noticed it too, she continued, getting up from the bench. I noticed that you had really changed. I saw you working, talking to people, taking on responsibilities. She took a step toward him. I saw the man you really are when you're not hiding. Another step. And I need to tell you something too. She stopped right in front of him, so close that he could feel the warmth of her body. I love you too. I fell in love with the man you are, not who you were or could have been, Fernando. Fernando felt the world stop. Elena whispered in disbelief. She smiled. I love you. And then Fernando could no longer contain himself. He pulled her toward him, wrapping his arms around her tightly but gently. Elena responded by hugging him, burying her face in his chest. They remained like that for a long time, simply feeling each other. When they separated enough to look at each other, Fernando held her face in his hands. May I? He asked, his eyes on her lips. Yes, Elena whispered. And then Fernando kissed her. It was a slow, deep kiss, charged with everything they had been unable to express in words. Months of loneliness, pain, and hope melted away in that moment. Elena felt the world spinning. She clung to his shoulders, responding with the same intensity. When they finally separated, they were both breathless. Fernando rested his forehead against hers. I promise I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of this love, he said hoarsely. You already are, Elena replied, smiling through her tears. They returned to the mansion hand in hand. Katerina watched them through the window and smiled, wiping away her own tears. That night, for the first time, they had dinner together again. But there was something different in the air. A pleasant tension full of unspoken promises. When they finished dinner, Fernando reached out his hand. Come with me. Elena took his hand. He led her up the stairs to the master bedroom. He stopped at the door and looked at her. Only if you want to, he said softly. I won't pressure you. Elena looked at the man she loved, who had fought so hard to be better. She touched his face gently. I want to. And they went in together. The door closed behind them. That night, Fernando and Elena gave themselves completely to each other, not only physically, but also in spirit. Fernando kept his promise to the letter. He never tasted a single drop of alcohol again, not at celebrations, not in difficult times, not even when temptation whispered in his ear. He had found something stronger than any addiction, Elena's love and his own self-respect. He fully assumed his role as Duke, both in name and in practice. Little by little, the respect he had lost returned multiplied. Those who had previously whispered with pity now spoke with admiration. They saw Duke Fernando and couldn't believe it. He was unrecognizable, completely transformed. And Duchess Elena, what a strong woman. What a presence. Both became an example for the city. Katerina and Ottavio were bursting with pride. I always knew our boy would come back, Katerina said with tears in her eyes as she watched Fernando working alongside Elena in the gardens. The Countess would be so proud, Ottavio agreed, and she really would be. Fernando had become the man his mother had dreamed of. Fair, hardworking, present, and loved. One spring morning, Elena woke up feeling strange, nauseous, and dizzy. Katerina, with her experience, recognized the signs immediately. My dear, she said with a huge smile, I think you're expecting a baby. Elena's heart raced. When she told Fernando that same night, he remained silent for a few seconds. Then he took her in his arms, spun her around, and began to laugh and cry at the same time. We're going to be parents, Elena. We're going to be parents. Fernando allowed himself to dream of fatherhood without fear, because this time he was present, sober, and whole. Fernando closely accompanied Elena throughout her pregnancy. He didn't let her exert herself. He was always by her side. He talked to her belly every night. "Daddy is here," he would say with his hand on her growing abdomen, and he would always be there. The delivery was difficult, but Elena was strong, stronger than anyone could have imagined. After hours of labor, the vigorous cries of two babies filled the mansion. A boy and a girl. Twins. Fernando saw Elena, exhausted but radiant, holding the two babies in her arms. He knelt beside the bed and looked at those tiny creatures. "They're perfect," he whispered, his voice breaking. "They're ours," Elena said, smiling. Fernando took the boy in his arms with infinite care. "Welcome to the world, little one." Then he took the girl. "And you too, princess?" They named the boy Victor and the girl Mariana, in honor of his mother. It was a way of honoring the past while building the future. The following months were the happiest that Mansion had ever known. When Fernando and Elena went down to the city with the twins, they were greeted with sincere smiles and blessings. "God bless the Alcantara family," people would shout, and God did bless them. One golden autumn afternoon, Fernando and Elena were sitting in the garden. They watched the twins playing on the lawn. Fernando took Elena's hand and intertwined their fingers. "You saved my life," he said simply. Elena turned to look at him. "You didn't let addiction defeat you," she added. Elena rested her head on his shoulder. "And look how far we've come." Together they gazed at the mansion, the flower-filled gardens, their healthy children, the life they had built together. "I love you, Elena," Fernando said, kissing the top of her head. "I love you too," she replied. And as the sun set over the Valley of the Saints, painting the sky gold and pink, the Alcantara family remained united. A story that had begun with pain, abandonment, and despair ended with love, healing, and hope. Because sometimes the best stories are born from the ashes of the worst tragedies. If you've reached the end of this story, tell us in the comments what moved you most about Elena and Fernando's journey. The moment she was given away as punishment and found a man as broken as she was. Her courage in transforming a dead mansion into a home full of life. Fernando's struggle with addiction, with falls and rises, until he finally overcame it. Every heart that is connected with this story of overcoming, love, and new beginnings is a gift to us. Elena teaches us that it is never too late to rebuild our lives, leave the past behind, and choose happiness. She shows us that even when we are treated as if we are worthless, we can rise up with dignity and strength. Fernando teaches us that addiction can be overcome when we find a greater purpose and decide to fight not only for ourselves but also for those we love. He shows us that transformation is possible, no matter how deep the abyss. This is a story about second chances, about how two broken souls can heal together, and about how true love does not appear in perfect fairy tales, but in the daily decisions not to give up, to try again, and to believe that we deserve to be happy. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now so you don't miss any stories full of love, emotion, overcoming adversity, and endings that warm the soul and renew your faith in true love. Leave your like if this story that has touched your heart and share it with someone who needs to believe that starting over is possible. Until the next story.